friends, Jenny at Clover and Violet here, and today I'm going to be showing you how to bind a mini quilt or a mug rug with a single fold binding. So your usual quilt binding is going to be double fold, so it's a 2.5-inch strip folded in half. But for these mini quilts and mug rugs, I like to use a single fold binding, so that's 1.5 inches strip, and it is not folded, it's just sewn straight to your quilt and then wrapped around to the back. So let me show you how I do that. Here's the small project we're going to be binding. This is just some leftover quilt blocks that I've sewn together, sandwiched with some batting and backing, and quilted. You can use this same technique for mug rugs, mini quilts. I just really like this particular technique because it uses less binding, so your binding isn't going to be thick, you're going to use less fabric. And then we're going to use 1.5-inch strips for this single fold binding technique. So I've cut 2, even though I think that 1 strip is going to make it all the way around this quilt. I'm cutting 2 because I would like to show you the technique that I use to join my strips. So I'm going to take both of my strips that I have are 1.5 inches, and I'm just going to trim off my salvage edge. And then we're going to place these strips right sides together at a 45-degree angle. And I'm just going to stick a pin in that. And we're going to sew from corner to corner on this angle. And then when you open it up, that will make your diagonal binding seam. And that's just going to kind of wrap around your quilt so that it won't show as much as a straight line. So I'm going to take us to the sewing machine, and I'm going to show you how to sew this binding seam, and then also we will work on attaching the binding to our mini quilt. Alright, so now that we're at the sewing machine, I'm going to be sewing with a bright pink 40 weight thread so that you can really easily see my stitches, but I would probably use something that blends in if I were sewing this for any other reason. I always start off my projects with leaders and enders, just so I can more easily not waste thread, and that way it doesn't, sometimes my foot will like push the fabric under there, but if I have something else going before it, that generally doesn't happen anyway. So I'm just going to sew across this on the diagonal. And then I'm going to trim my fabric about 1/4 inch. From the sewing line. And then there you're going to see that nice, neat 45-degree angle join. And I just like to press the seams open on these joining seams so that they're nice and flat and not pushed to one side. So I'm going to step over and press that really quick, and then I will be right back here to sew the binding onto our mini quilt. Alright, so now that we've pressed our seam open, I'm just going to start by placing my binding right sides down, and you'll notice that this is not folded. When you do a traditional quilt binding, you're going to use this a 2.5-inch piece, and it's going to be folded in half, and then your raw edge is going to line up here. Well, in this case, it's a single fold binding, and so we're not going to fold it at all. So this is just my 1.5-inch piece completely flat. I'm going to leave myself a good amount of tail, maybe 3-4 inches, and then I'm going to start sewing my sewing machine automatically fixes my stitches at the beginning, but if yours does not, I would just backstitch once or twice, and that's going to prevent you from having any loose threads right there. So we're just going to stitch. And my seam allowance is 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to stop when I am 1/4 inch from the end of my quilt. So I have a little bit of fabric, quilt fabric underneath, and I'm just going to backstitch. And then I'm going to cut my stitches. So now I'm going to take this piece of binding and I'm going to turn it up at a 45-degree angle. So you can see it's not sewn all the way to the edge right there. And then I'm just turning it up and making that nice, neat 45-degree angle right there. And then I'm going to take this binding piece and come straight back down. So this part right here has a fold. So now I'm straight back down, and then I'm just going to sew again. This time I'm going to start from the very corner, backstitch if necessary, and I'm just going to sew again straight down my seam, and then stopping when I get to 1/4 inch. And again, I'm going to backstitch and cut my thread. Then we're going to turn again at a 45-degree angle, going straight up. And then bring your binding back down so that your next fold is even with the edge you've just sewn. We're going to start in the corner and sew again. And then I'm just going to continue around this mini quilt, sew the next 2 corners, and then we'll talk about how to join that binding. Alright, so when you've reached the part of your quilt where your binding is ready to be joined, leave a nice gap in your sewing. And then what you're going to do is, I'm using the little piece I cut off of my strip, the end piece, but you're going to cut a piece that's the width of your binding. So this is 1.5 inch piece. And then I lay it on top of this piece this is the first seam I've sewn. Then you're going to lay the next one over the top, and you're going to cut it so that they overlap by exactly the amount of the width of the binding. So these are going to overlap by 1.5 inches. Let me cut this. So now you can see that these 2 binding strips are about exactly 1.5 inches of overlap. So then I'm going to draw a line in that same space, that 1.5 inches. I'm going to draw a 45-degree line, and this line should have the end of it should be 1.5 inches down your strip. So that's how you'll know if you're drawing the line in the right direction. All right, so after I've drawn that 45-degree angle, I'm going to turn both of my strips again at a 45-degree angle, just like we did for the joining of the strips before. So this is the same method, different location. So we're going to join those corners, place a pin, and you want your pin to be going across your piece. So then I'm just going to sew on that line. And then you can see that my binding is going to lay flat, and there's my diagonal seam. So I'm just going to trim this like we did before. Going to finger press it open, and then just sew the remainder of my binding loop. Then once I've sewn it, we're going to fold our binding around to the back. And you can see where we folded those corners, you have a perfect miter. So we're just going to fold this all the way around to the back. And I'm just going to take you back over to the cutting table so that you can see how I hand finish this. So here we have our finished mini quilt or mug rug. You can see how those corners became perfectly mitered when we folded our binding around to the back. And then I'm just going to show you how we finish it. I'm going to be finishing mine by hand, but you could certainly follow these steps and then sew it with a sewing machine instead of by hand. So you're going to take your raw edge and you're going to fold it down to meet the edge of your project. And then you're just going to take that edge, the now fold, and fold it again. And then you can pin or clip. I'm just going to use these Wonder Clips. And just going to fold and clip around the entire quilt. If I'm doing a large quilt, I would be using different binding, but I would only clip a few at a time. But when I'm doing a mini quilt, I really like to just clip everything so that it's all nice and neat. Now when you get to the corner, I kind of like to tuck it so that the corner stands up. Then I'll clip a space past my corner and then go back and fold it to get that nice, neat, mitered corner. I'm just going to pin that. So we'll just keep going around. Alright, so here we have our whole project clipped, but I just want to point out to you, you see this seam line that is where we sewed our binding to the front. If you're going to machine finish, the thing you want to make sure is that your binding overlaps that seam line everywhere by just maybe a 1/16 of an inch at the minimum. And then when you turn it over, you'll just stitch in the ditch of that seam line, and that will make sure that you catch your whole binding around on the other side. But I'm going to finish mine by hand. So I have some thread and a milliner's needle. I know this is hard to see, but milliner's needles have the same size eye as the needle. So it really is just going to glide through your project. So those are my needles of choice for things like binding and English paper piecing. I always double my thread when I sew, but I think that that's just a habit. And then I'll just choose a spot. I'm going to start near a corner so I can show you how I go around that corner. So I'm going to tuck in my needle. This will just get my thread tail inside my project easily. And then all you're going to do is just grab a little bit of your binding, and then you're going to slip into your backing and your binding, but not all the way through to the front of your project. Just make a little stitch to travel down your quilt. It's hard to give you a good view while still seeing what I'm doing, so bear with me. And you may notice I am using matching thread on the back because this is where it's really going to show all those little stitches into your binding. Alright, so when I get to the corner, I just want to make sure that I get the bottom piece and the top piece both through my needle. And I'm just going to turn the corner. And I usually try to take a couple small stitches right here near the corner so that I can more easily make sure I've got everything pinned down. Well, I'm just going to finish stitching this up and then I will show you the finished product. Alright, before I finish binding this quilt, I did also want to tell you a little bit about the thread gloss that I usually use when I am binding. So this thread gloss is by So Fine thread gloss, but there are several other thread wax makers out there. I just feel like this has the right amount of scent for me. So you can see I'm just placing my thread on the wax. This one's been used a lot. There's a little black thread left over. You can use this with any weight thread. I use it with my pearl cotton thread for hand quilting and obviously just regular thread for binding. So you're just going to push your thumb into the wax and pull the thread through. I usually do about 2 swipes through. It's harder with a long piece of thread, but this is really going to cut down on tangles and knots and breakage. So I love to use this type of product when I am hand sewing pretty much anything. And now I've stitched all the way around my binding, and my mini quilt or mug rug is complete. So you can see how neat and kind of low profile that single fold binding technique is. I hope this helps you finish those small projects, and thanks for watching.